You might have seen headlines about Bangladesh, from violent protests to their Prime Minister fleeing the country. What started as student-led protests against a jobs quota has now led to political unrest. In recent days, Bangladesh's president has assigned a Nobel Peace Prize winner to lead an interim government. What does this mean for the country, and how did it get to this point?
So Nandini, I feel like this is a story where I've seen lots of headlines, I've seen lots of vision, but I do feel like if you haven't been here for the whole time of reading into what is happening into Bangladesh, it's a bit difficult to understand where we've gotten to. Can you take us back and just explain a bit of those headlines? Where does this story begin?
Bangladesh has been making global headlines lately, and we started to hear about these student-led protests last month. But in the past week, tensions have really ramped up with a complete uprooting of their government.
You mentioned that it all started with these student-led protests. What are they protesting? Why are there students in the streets? What's it all about?
So these university students band together against a jobs quota that was enforced by the government. Essentially, this quota reserved 30% of all public service jobs for the families of veterans who served in the country's War of Independence. So a quick history lesson, Bangladesh, formerly known as East Pakistan, split from West Pakistan in 1971, and that's when they created the country we now know as Bangladesh.
And so you're saying that the relatives of the veterans of that war that you just mentioned, they are now being given 30% of public sector roles in Bangladesh. Is that right?
Exactly. And so students protested against this quota, arguing that jobs should be given based on skill and merit instead of family lineage. These protests ramped up, with more people getting involved in demonstrations against the government and the police and the military. Late last month, the government then reduced this jobs quota to 5%, but violent protests were still continuing.
And you've intimated it there, but we haven't explicitly spoken about it, that they have become violent, these protests, and the clashes between government, police, these protesters. What have they looked like? What have these protests involved?
There's a lot of footage out there about these protests. There's cars being burnt, buildings and statues being vandalised, and a significant number of deaths. Reporting on the death toll, however, really varies. Some outlets would say nearly 100 deaths, whereas other reports say around 500 deaths. Last week, the government tried to control these protests by introducing things like internet and phone outages, citywide shutdowns, and curfews.
And so despite the restrictions that you just mentioned, the protesters didn't stop. It continued until a point, right?
Yes, and if anything, students grew stronger in support from the public, and they were calling for the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to step down, which she did.
And now this takes us to the next big part of the story, which is about the Prime Minister. And I think now's a good point just to mention that in Bangladesh there is both a president and a Prime Minister, but for the sake of this story, we're just talking about the PM. Who is she and why did she flee?
So Hasina was Bangladesh's longest-serving leader, and there were strong calls from protesters for her resignation. Some important context here is that her father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, was the first president of Bangladesh, and he's also known as the father of the nation. His party, it's called the Awami League, was the ruling party of Bangladesh pretty much until this week. In 2020, the Human Rights Watch accused the Awami League of silencing opposition and outlined allegations of fraud. At the time, Brad Adams, the Asia director at the Human Rights Watch, said there was, quote, international concern about the Awami League's increasing bent towards authoritarianism.
Okay, I want to take this opportunity to just recap where we're at. So tell me if I've said something wrong. I'm going to try and recap what you said. So this story starts with protests, and student protesters are angry about a government policy that would see certain jobs allocated to the families of veterans who served in a war. Those student protests have continued, they've grown, and it has led to the resignation of the country's Prime Minister, a female Prime Minister, who was from a party called the Awami League. That party had attracted some criticism, like you just said, from the Human Rights Watch. And so now we're in a situation where the Prime Minister has left the country, has resigned. What happens from there?
So Hasina's resignation was announced by the army chief, and in this time where the Prime Minister is now gone, has stepped down, the military took control, and they were in control until an interim government could be formed. So an interim government is a temporary body that aims to set up a permanent government in a time of an emergency, like in Bangladesh right now.
Yeah. And so who's leading this interim government if the PM's gone?
So the Bangladeshi president, now Bangladesh has a prime minister and president, their president has appointed Muhammad Yunus as the leader of the interim government. So I'll give you a bit of context on who Yunus is. He was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for founding a bank that supports Bangladesh's poorer population by approving smaller loans that wouldn't otherwise be approved by larger banks.
Okay.
In other words, he developed this concept that we now call microlending or microfinancing.
Mm-hmm.
Then in 2007, he proposed a new political party called Nagarik Shakti, which basically translates to citizens' power. But this party didn't hold up because there was a lack of candidates.
Okay, so you've just mentioned there that he proposed a new political party. It didn't take off, but he's presumably not from the Awami League if he was setting up his own party, right? So how does that work?
Here's where it gets really interesting, because assigning Yunus as the leader of the interim government wasn't actually the president's choice. This was because of pressure and demands from student protesters who said they wanted Yunus to lead the interim government.
So traditionally the president would have appointed whoever the interim leader was, but in this case it was because of the student protesters that someone else was installed.
Yes, there's so much pressure from these demonstrations. And it's really interesting because he's actually been a long-time critic and opponent of the now former Prime Minister Hasina. Yunus was charged with a range of things last year, including money laundering and corruption. Human rights groups have claimed that these charges were politically motivated under Hasina's power. Amnesty International called for an end to this, quote, harassment and intimidation.
Wow. So there's this real shifting of power in Bangladesh. And I mean, I know that this isn't the biggest part of the story, but something worth noting is how much of this change has come from young people in the country. They have quite literally installed a new leader. It's quite remarkable to see from afar.
Yeah, definitely. And look, most of these developments have played out literally in the last few days.
Yeah.
So it's a story that's changing really fast day by day, and it's one that we definitely want to keep an eye on and find out what the future of Bangladesh's government looks like.
Thank you so much, Nandini. It's something I have learnt a lot about, and I know that our listeners will too. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Daily Aus. If you are listening on Spotify or Apple, or you're watching us on YouTube, hit follow or subscribe. That way the platforms know that you like what we're doing and we'll serve you more of it. We'll be back again tomorrow, but until then, have a great day.